on the Zoom can see. Here's some more pamphlets if anybody didn't get one. For those of you that are here earning some bonus points for your classes, do make sure that you use that QR code on the very front that says earning bonus points standing. It'll ask you to register again. It's not the same event. I like added an extra one under the same name. So make sure you check that one because I will use that check-in list for that registration list rather to send all of the texts. Okay. Thank you all for coming in and participating in the Topics in Forensic Science seminar event. I'm very excited to have you all here. I'm glad you all showed up. We're super excited. I'd like to go ahead and give you guys a brief overview of what PsyChi is. It's a PsyChi sponsored event today, and PsyChi is the International Honor Society for Psychology Students. Okay. And if you want to look through the pamphlet, it'll give you more information about who we are. You do not have to be an official member to attend our events. We do things like journal club, we'll meet once a month, and go through some journal articles so you guys can get more familiar with research and psychology, learn some of that jargon, be able to decipher through those articles and the studies. We also do things like today's seminar, speaker events. We plan to do some career fairs, get you guys some scholarship opportunities and some summer internship opportunities, as well as some other things. So that's what PsyChi has to offer. I don't believe the membership requirement, you do not have to be a psychology major or minor to be in PsyChi. You have to take, I think, 3 classes, so 1 credit hours, but you can obviously sit on the pamphlet. On the very back of the pamphlet, it'll say join us. That QR code, if you guys don't mind just scanning that real quick, it's gonna be a little questionnaire about today's events. And then your interest in being a member of PsyChi, we're gonna have an interest meeting on April 4th at 11 a.m. right here in the auditorium, where we will go ahead and vote for our leadership team and our officers for starting next fall, so that 2023-2024 year, as well as we'll discuss some event ideas that we have, some t-shirt ideas, and get things started for in the fall. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Leah Jackson. She is our department chair here in Psychology and Sociology, and she is the brains behind the organization. She helps us fund things like this, helps us organize it. We really appreciate her working with us and making this possible today. All right. You may have any questions before we start? We're going to go ahead and get started. I believe Mr. Wise is first, so give a round of applause.
Yes, my name is Chase Wise. I am a licensed professional counselor from, I work at Kramer's Children's Center. Kramer's Children's Center is an advocacy center. What we do is we work with children who have been abused or gone through any adverse childhood experiences. We give them what's called forensic interviews. Those are approved interviews that can go to court. They're also helpful for the kids so they're not more traumatized than they have to be. What I do is I see kids who have gone through trauma and I help them process that trauma and so that they can get back to their old selves and feel better. I have a couple handouts for you guys. The first thing on here I have is a sheet about adverse childhood experiences. This is based off a questionnaire we use called the ACE questionnaire. It is a 1 to 10 scale that looks at certain situations that kids may go through that might negatively affect them in their lives. That's like any kind of neglect, abuse, separation, discrimination, bigotry, racism, war, conflict, anything like that can have a negative effect on our kids. And that can lead to symptoms of PTSD. I've got a handout here about what PTSD is, some of the symptoms of that. If you guys are in psychology, what's PTSD, are you familiar with this stuff? But we can break in PTSD into 4 different parts. Intrusions, which is things coming in our head because we don't want them to. Avoidance, which is running away from the thing that felt scary or dangerous. Negative cognitions and mood, which are negative thoughts about what happened to us, about ourselves, about the world around us. And also negative feelings, sadness, despair, worry, stress, anxiety. And finally, reactivity, kind of looking over your shoulder for danger, being on edge, angry, jumpy, control sleeping, stuff like that. So we look at kids that have those symptoms coming in. You hear from those symptoms, a lot of our kids are usually labeled as bad kids or problem kids. But really they've gone through hard things. And so fighting that avoidance by talking about what they've been through, what we call trauma narrative. Where right now, this epic happened, we have thoughts and feelings to it, and we challenge it. We can process what they've been through, and they can get away from some of these things. The way we do that is through a therapy. There's a couple different evidence-based therapies you can use. The one we use most often, in my opinion, is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. It does this by breaking down avoidance and challenging those thoughts that we have, that we may be avoiding thinking about that could cause us harm. Does anyone have any questions for me? Try to go fast. I can talk for like 2 hours on this. I didn't want to go too much. Questions? Thank you.
Chase Wise. If you guys want to go and read his bio, you can go to that corner right there. Read more about him. It's got some contact info. If you guys would like to get in touch with him after the presentation. All right, our next presenter is Instructor Taylor. Come on up.
I'm Lieutenant Miller. I've been here at UNA since 2010. We started the crime scene investigation program here in 2016. Part of that, to give you a little bit of background on myself, I used to be a Florence police officer investigator for 9 years. And of that 9 years, investigated several homicides, rapes, robberies, all of that. About a year and a half into patrol, I was told that incidentally I had lifted somehow my own fingerprint. And so I had to eat my humble pie at that moment. But from that moment, I started studying about crime scene cross-contamination. And what I've noticed over time, if you will, is that our culture, law enforcement culture, has a lot to do with it. Dr. Bertrand and also has done a lot with cultural impact of law enforcement. And it does impact on how we process just basic things. Go ahead. And if you'll notice here, this is a typical box of gloves that we typically use. Now, if you had given me this as a patrolman, I would have had a heyday. Like, you're actually going to give me a whole box of gloves. So we want to end up, and you're going to see why for that. But what I noticed when I was an investigator, I was asked to back up some patrol. They got backed up on the calls, and so they couldn't process the B&E of the vehicle. And so I went out there to help them, and I'm not joking. I went to my latex. I had actually a box of gloves as an investigator, and I pulled out the gloves, and it was one hot July day. I was putting them on. Now understand, I was trying to get some DNA evidence, and as I was putting them on, I noticed that I did this to it. What am I doing? I don't need to do that. And so it was literally at that point that I realized how much I possibly had cross-contaminated this. And you may think that, by George, weren't you trained to do otherwise? Well, no, is the answer to that. Do you know how many hours patrolmen get of crime scene processing even today at the academy? They get only 10 hours. Years ago, I got 0 hours, if you will, for the effect of it when I went to the academy in 2000. Today they get 10, 2-3 years ago, they only got 8. And so from thereafter, you do not have to get crime scene training. You get to pick what training you get for 12 hours. So after that, what I realized is that, as I was looking at a homicide case, I was looking at the DNA. Now, this is a DNA report from that particular case. If you'll notice, the way that it's looked, I have notes written here, and these are my legit notes from when I was processing it. And what you'll notice is the word, what this UNK female, when that DNA came back, it came back to an unknown female, and it also had an unknown male in there. Let me explain to you, on this homicide, I was assigned to crime scene. Now, we have our gloves, but you understand that we did not have facial PPE. That was not part of our culture or our training. You think that it is, but it's actually not years ago. We talked about the CSI effect, what we've learned since then. If you'll notice right here, so the unknown female and the unknown male right here, right there, guess who was else collecting the cigarettes? My male partner was. So I do wonder if this unknown female is me. Because do you know that I never got engaged my DNA bugle swab? I didn't. Now, when you become a police officer, you are required to keep your fingerprints. And I gave my fingerprints, and guess what? By doors I cross-contaminated that, I left my own print, did I not? And the only reason that I knew that I had cross-contaminated that being the case is they already had my fingerprints on file. What ADFS, Alabama Department of Forensic Science, does not have on file is my DNA profile or a bugle swab elimination sample. They've never asked that. I've never been asked that, and I haven't given one. But I will tell you, in the back of my mind, I do wonder if the unknown female is me, and I do wonder if the unknown male is my partner at the scene. Okay. So if you'll notice here, when we talk about culture, unknown DNA samples to an investigator is almost a rabbit hole if that DNA actually comes back to a cop. A cop processing the scene will transpose their DNA to, it's called Locker's exchange principle. But the reality of it is that hardly any police officer has ever given their bugle swab as an elimination sample. Let me explain to you how that might work. If you had your house broken into, and say they stole your TV, we would get your prints as elimination prints, but we would also get your bugle swab, because if they happen not to leave prints, they're going to leave potentially DNA. Now, you obviously touched your TV, you've obviously been in your house, and so for us to pull that, we want to make sure that your DNA will be said, this is DNA, but it's the homeowner's, right? And this is fingerprints, but it's the homeowner's fingerprints. That makes sense. What doesn't make sense is why are we not collecting DNA from the police officer? But if you'll notice right here, the police union, they have the cultural context to say, look, if you're ever asked for your DNA, do not give it. Why do you think they have touted this police culture?
It could be potentially incriminating.
Could be potentially incriminating. Now, I'm going to get to that momentarily, but I want you to understand here, conversely, with the United Kingdom, every police officer in that country has their DNA on file. It's not CODIS that's its own file. And believe it or not, if I gave my DNA as a bugle swab, my DNA bugle swab will not go to CODIS. Now, CODIS is what the crime scene DNA that we all know about, that you've heard FBI CODIS, right? But what I have come to find out is that cops actually have a misunderstanding. And so I presented this at an IAI conference back summer 2019, and I asked the police officer, said, how many times or how many cases, scenes have you worked? 100, 200? And yeah, definitely 500. All right, and then keep your hands raised. Now, of how many never give me your DNA. That's right. I said, why? If I were to ask you to give me your DNA, why would you not? And they said, quote, I didn't want to get caught. What are they going to get caught doing? What do you think that their thought process is? That they're doing it wrong, right? Well, what are they doing wrong? They're actually not doing anything wrong. It's the fact that they're simply being in the scene. Once you go inside of the room, pieces of you are there. You're going to take pieces of this room back with you. I don't know if you know that, but you will. Good. But this is a standard crime scene log that I use at Florence PD and Clinton Medicine. Next, you'll notice my question is, why not add a column of, look, you're about to go under my crime scene tape. The reality of it is, crime scene personnel have to fight, the chiefs have to come in, the deputy chiefs, and everybody wants to come in. That's not supposed to happen. I'm telling you, if you say, all right, if you go underneath my yellow tape, open your cheek, we're going to swab for DNA. Now, at the end of the day, this is a consensual thing, okay? But I will say that why aren't we asking for DNA elimination samples from the police officers? DNA cannot go in the CODIS unless it matches two requirements. It has to come from the crime scene, and it has to be connected to evidence that the suspect touched. If I get DNA from my cheek, yes or no, does that come from a crime scene? Come from me, not the crime scene. So the buccal swab from my cheek will never enter FBI CODIS. It's not going to, unless what? Think about it. Keep advancing. Keep that thought in your head. We'll go from there. So the question is, can DNA be transferred from a latex glove to evidence? The answer is yes. And what this study done is the longer you hold something, the more DNA alleles that will be transferred. It's basically the point. This research keeps building upon itself, and I know I'm short on time, but moreover, in 2016, what they did is they said, I wonder, does this box of gloves, how many of y'all ever seen this in the doctor's office? Yep, it's on the wall in it. Which glove do they use first? The first one. Do you know that there's DNA on that glove? So this is what I make my students do. Now, I know I did. I used the first glove on that box for years as a child. So if it already had a DNA on it, we know that DNA can be transferred from the glove to evidence. So in theory, what are we doing by using the box of glove like this? We are literally transferring DNA to where?
Everywhere.
The crime scene. So this is what I make my students do. I literally say, all right, come the first, third, fourth, it's out. All right. Now they are required to, at that point, it ain't over. They're going to have to meticulously get this glove out with using only the wrist and not touching the fingertips. Okay, because I don't want them to cross-contaminate. And so therefore, it basically throw the first 3 or 4 gloves away. Here's the point. Gloves since COVID are extremely expensive. So most police departments are going to use this, much less sterile gloves, which is more expensive. Ideally, you technically, in theory, should use a sterile glove for every piece of evidence that you touch. But economically, that's probably not going to happen. What about that? Everybody seen that on a patrol belt? Now, look, when I was a patrolman, now as an investigator, I got a box. This is my box. You get my box. As a patrolman, this is what we were allowed to do. Oh yeah, come get you some gloves. I might collect a lot of evidence. I'm gonna keep in there. I'm gonna put it in my pouch on my belt. Now look, what am I touching? The gloves with my what?
Hand.
Bare hand. I was all in it. Now I'm gonna go collect evidence with my bare hands. I'm I'm gonna put the gloves on. In effect, what am I doing? Oh yeah, all over it, right? We're not trained otherwise. So this, keep going. This actually came out this last year. So the question then became, oh yeah, so if it can happen with gloves, can it happen with bags? Oh yeah. Now, as an evidence manager, I was evidence manager for 6 months. I always had to make sure that the patrolman had evidence bags. You know how many times I went to the evidence vault, they give us a bag, I ran out, we got it. And I would get a whole load of bags, barehanded. I would take them to my patrol car, and then I would take them to my trunk, barehanded with my hands, and then put them down, then put my gloves on. So where's my DNA? On the bag. Now we'll take my gloves, uncontaminated gloves, and then touch the bag. The DNA from the bag is going to transfer where? The glove, then the DNA from the glove is going to go where? To the evidence. My DNA is going to go to the evidence. If you look, DNA from this is United States now. DNA from 6 police officers was found with evidence that had never worked the case. You know who that probably might be? The evidence manager. That means the bag. Okay. Also, if you look, 56% of the evidence bags had DNA on them from the actual police personnel that worked at crime scene. So my question is this. Sorry, go ahead, Vince. What should the policy be, if you will? What should the training be? Should it just be 10 hours of crime scene for academy? I would say no. I would even venture out to say is where we need to focus on research is asking and retraining our police, do you use the patrol belt glove? And if you do you happen to collect any evidence with it? So we got a long way in terms of education for our crime scene personnel. And I know I probably went up 10 minutes, but there you go. Thank you all very much. I do have some handouts on PowerPoint if you want them later.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Barksdale. I'm the district attorney in Franklin County, Alabama. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I did not graduate from the University of Alabama. My wife, Mandy Barksdale, teaches accounting here at UNA, and our new assistant district attorney, Fallon Scott Spar, is a recent criminal justice major from the University of North Alabama. So happy to be here today. My understanding today that the topic was going to be forensics, and I've approached that mostly from, I guess, a physical forensics sort of point of view, but I feel like I've got time. I'll kind of talk a little bit more about what our office does in terms of like forensic interviewing, which would be more like psychology or counseling type matters. So forensics is obviously a pretty critical element of the criminal justice system. And while the district attorney's office, at least in Franklin County, doesn't perform any type of forensic work itself, we do frequently work with forensic scientists and others who are trained in forensics. And that's going to include forensic interviews and counselors like Chase. And I'll get into that later another time. So in a smaller county like Franklin, most if not all crime scene investigation and evidence collection is going to be handled by police officers who have had, and my notes say extensive training and experience. Now, Instructor Taylor may be saying that's not quite as extensive as it should be. I'm not gonna argue that point, but most of that evidence collection is going to be handled by sworn police officers as opposed to civilians. Now, while some district attorneys will occasionally visit major crime scenes, I typically don't. I share some of the concerns on contamination or otherwise with Instructor Taylor. I think in the very unlikely event I'm at a crime scene and I find that key piece of evidence, like I've got zero training. District attorneys don't have any training in crime scene collection. Some may be better at it than others, but that's not something that they teach you. But If I were to find that one key piece of evidence, I'd probably make myself a witness in the case. It's been hard to prosecute that case. So again, you see differences of opinion. Some district attorneys will go to crime scenes, some won't. But that said, our role in that stage of investigation is mostly advisory. A common forensics related question that we might field as prosecutor, as district attorney, or assistant district attorney would be something along the lines of, do we need a search warrant to access this particular vehicle or house or room of the house to collect evidence? So that's where we would generally weigh in at that point in the process. We might also have some suggestions as to what type of evidence that should be collected, or we're thinking about the eventual trial. If it gets to that point, we might have some suggestions as to how video should be framed or what kind of photographs should be taken. Now, while physical evidence, at least in our area, is typically going to be collected by police officers, once that evidence is collected, it's primarily going to be examined and tested by civilians employed with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. The Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences employs folks in a wide variety of roles. You're going to have medical examiners, pathologists, and forensic scientists who are experts in fields such as drug chemistry, forensic biology, be like DNA and things of that nature, firearm and tool marks, fire debris, and toxicology. So these experts are professionals, and I'll stress, they are very effective and very essential in a criminal trial. As an attorney, you develop sort of a sense as to when the fact finder in a case, whether it's a judge in a bench trial or a jury in a jury trial, whether that fact finder is paying close attention to a witness. And I can tell you that invariably in the trials that I've participated in my opinion at the very least, invariably the closest attention is going to be paid to those forensic experts. And I think you heard earlier today something called the CSI. And I think there's something to be said for that. That's been defined as what I would think would be the exaggerated portrayal of forensic science on crime television shows such as CSI has influenced the public perception of the legal process. So this so-called CSI effect most often refers to the phenomenon where jurors may come to demand more forensic evidence in criminal trials, effectively raising the burden of proof for the prosecution. So I don't necessarily agree with that, and in my opinion, I don't necessarily think that jurors are demanding more forensic evidence so much as they have faith in the objective nature of forensic science itself. And that's what I think we as a society expect from the field of forensic science. We expect objective scientific findings that can be trusted, whether it assists in the prosecution of an individual or whether it actually absolves someone. So kind of what I prepared, but I would like to circle back a little bit more, talk about, I guess, sort of the psychology component of forensics, since that's what we're here on today. In our role as prosecutors, we frequently have child victims, and child victims are a lot of times asked to tell the very traumatic story of what happened in too many times. And that's where a forensic interviewer like Chase, someone who's trained to get to that story, get it recorded, get the facts out, minimize the number of times that child victim is going to have to tell that story. Now, for child victims who are under 12, we can actually play that recorded forensic interview at trial, and that's a huge benefit in a lot of sexual abuse cases or other child abuse cases involving child victims. So that type of forensic interviewer plays a very important role in the work of our office. So that said, if I've got a few more minutes to talk, I think I'd like to specifically talk about a couple of the cases that the Franklin County District Attorney's Office has handled where forensic evidence has played a large role. And probably the most famous case to come out of Franklin County in recent years would have been the case of Christy Michelle Scott, who was tried and convicted back in 2008. This was a little bit before my time in the office. I became an assistant DA in that office in 2014, but I worked with the DA that handled that case. So Christy Scott, if you're not familiar with that case, was convicted of capital murder for the murder of her 6-year-old son by arson in Russellville, Alabama in 2008. The prosecution, our office, the Franklin County District Attorney's Office, accused Scott of setting this fatal fire to collect on insurance policies. So in preparation for today, I asked my former employer, former District Attorney Joseph Rushing, what he thought some of the most important pieces of physical evidence in that case were in terms of forensic evidence. And what he told me was that on Christy Scott, the forensics that really helped that case were the drug levels in the victim's body. This would be that 8-year-old that was killed. He said, I can't remember exact numbers, but she had given him a huge dose of cough medicine that was something like 5 times the normal dose. And we theorized that this was done to ensure that he slept through the fire. He further noted that he felt like the smoking gun in the case, in terms of forensic evidence, was a smoke alarm, which was examined by forensic experts. And these experts were able to tell that the smoke alarm was pulled away from the wall and wires snapped versus accidentally falling on the floor. And they were able to determine this by examining the smoke chamber of the smoke alarm and determining it was never activated, meaning it was pulled off the wall prior to the fire getting to the point where it should have sounded the alarm. So forensic evidence certainly played an important role in that case. We see recent cases that I've handled. We had another capital murder case, Shannon Gargis. In that case, the forensic evidence that was important was digital evidence. I'm guessing a lot of you are maybe interested in forensics. You're here today. I'm sure all of you know that this right here keeps up with a lot of information. It is a very, very detailed diary of what you've been up to, where you've been, pictures you've taken, pictures you might have thought that you deleted. In the Gargis trial, the defendant's version of events became that another incident that caused the fatal injuries to this child. That child was already severely injured by the point that he came into the care of Mr. Gargis. Well, Mr. Gargis had taken some pictures and even a video of this child eating and drinking, eating some cereal. Child did not appear to be severely injured in his pictures. He had deleted those from his phone, but I believe it was Mr. Ken Rager, I think he works up here in the Florence area, did a forensic download of his cell phone. Come to find out, we've got date stamped photos of a very uninjured child, very happily eating cereal. So he wound up being convicted of manslaughter and aggravated child abuse, serving a 40-year sentence. So all that said, forensics is very important to what we do as district attorney. So any questions? Thank you.
Now that we're about midway through, Ms. Tidwell's gonna come up and give her presentation. I just want to let you guys know, the restrooms are right out from the store. There's one on either side of men's and women's. As well as you're welcome to get some more food and drinks as well as you want. We're going to get started with our next presenter.
Hi, I'm Kenna Tidwell. I'm a certified victim service officer with the state of Alabama. I'm also a nationally certified advocate with NOVA, which is the National Organization of Victims Assistance. I'm also a licensed officer in LPC here in the state of Alabama, and also currently the president of the Alabama Counseling Board of Examiners in Montgomery. But today I'm going to talk about what my role is as a victim service officer. I assist victims throughout the criminal justice process. I do a lot of crisis intervention. I work with victims of violent crimes, which are sexual assault victims, domestic violence victims, robbery victims, and homicide survivors. I also created the Shoals Homicide Survivors Group. I run that group along with VOCAL, which is the Victims of Crime and Leniency organization that works with homicide survivors locally. Like I said, I do a lot of crisis intervention. What victim service officers are actually mandated by statute. We actually have constitutional things that we have to do, which is notify victims, make sure that they are present and have a voice in the proceedings. But we are to be like the conscience, the moral compass of the district attorney's office. We have to have a great relationship with our prosecutors and our prosecuting team and work with them and let them know about victims, like what the victim wants, what's going on in their lives. So our job is to be with the victim from beginning to end. I have been there on my 19th year. So I have victims that were there that happened, their crimes happened at the time that I became a victim service officer, that I still have a relationship with because now they're in parole hearings, because parole hearings are, happen every 5 years once they start happening. So I have developed very close relationships with my victims because you have to, because usually from start to finish, with a violent crime, average is about 3 to 4 years. So you're working with those families or that victim one-on-one, whether that be a child victim, which normally we work with those parents until we're actually getting ready for trial, and then we have the child come in and get them ready for court. But with domestic violence victims, that is one of them, and also sexual assault victims and homicide survivors, but robbery victims as well. Anything that's defined by the statute as a violent crime is who we work with. We are in charge of families and victims during the court proceedings. So once court starts, I'm in charge. Like, I have to tell them, you know, this is how this is gonna go. This is what to expect when they get in there. Because they have to treat it like they're going to church, and you have to be quiet when you're in a courtroom. Some people don't know that. You have to tell them how to dress, kind of what's gonna happen and what the judge expects. And different judges expect different things in the courtroom. Some judges are stricter than others, so some judges allow drinks in the courtroom, some don't. Some would send a bailiff when your phone goes off or vibrates and take it from you. There's some judges that don't. So our job is to make sure that victim and their family knows this is what's going to happen and this is what's expected to be in the courtroom. But I'll tell you over the years that our judges have gotten more lenient on that. We used to have a very strict judge who any kind of noise in the courtroom, he would stop a proceeding and like address you. Like if you're rattling candy or but our judges aren't that bad anymore. And he absolutely is my favorite judge of all time anyway. He was very strict. And would embarrass you if you made a noise and or would say, but we are responsible. Service officers were created by statute, and actually the Bill of Rights. And I wanted to talk about a little bit of the history of victims' rights. It started with President Reagan in 1982. If you didn't know, he established the Task Force on Victims of Crime, which started lots of funding for victims organizations. But how we got started here in the state of Alabama was a very grassroots effort by homicide survivors, led by, and if you don't know who that is, Marion Sheehan. She is the founder of VOCAL, which is the Victims of Crime and Leniency, which is in Montgomery. We have our own local chapter, the Lauderdale County, the Shoals chapter of VOCAL, and we have members of that. But she started it because her daughter was murdered in 1976. She was 21 years old. She was kidnapped, raped, and murdered by 3 men in Birmingham. She was a student at Birmingham Southern College. She was actually packed up and ready to go home for the weekend because it was Christmas break. Her boyfriend was cooking dinner that night. And they didn't have salad dressing. We asked her to go get salad dressing. It was just down the road at one of the convenience stores. 3 men watched her, stalked her, kidnapped her. She was not seen again after that. She was found a few days later. Her body was. She had been raped and shot and left on the side of the road. But Marion, because of that tragedy and what happened to her, she had to sit through 7 trials with 3 different defendants. One has been put to death already. The other 2, one's got life without. The other one, there's one of the 3 that she still has to go to parole hearings for. But Marion is the founder of Victims' Rights in the state of Alabama. She's the reason that if you're a victim of a crime, you have a right to sit in the courtroom, because in the 70s and 80s, you had no right to sit in the courtroom, and she was actually asked to leave the courtroom during her daughter's trial because she cried. When they were talking about the autopsy, of her daughter, she got upset and she expect that, which they cannot do that anymore. They can't keep you out of the courtroom. But that's because of Miriam Sheehan. And because of what happened to her daughter, she started that grassroots effort to get legislation passed, and established Vocal in 1982. There is an investigative discovery special. It's called On the Case with Paul Zahn, Fatal Errand, season 11. You can watch it, but it is on Discovery Channel. That is actually the history of victims' rights in the state of Alabama, how that started. That is the actual history, and they interview Miriam, but it talks about her journey through the criminal justice process and how she was treated, how she was very poorly and badly treated in the state of Alabama in the 70s and 80s during those trials. But it's the reason that she started Vocal, and it's the reason we have rights now. But Miriam actually turned 90 in January. She is one of my mentors and one of my heroes, and I have had many conversations with her, and actually had the pleasure of driving her around places in Montgomery, and she is an absolute fireball at 90. January, I'll tell you when the first legislation began. The Victims' Rights Bill was passed January 1st, 1996. Prior to 1996, we had no rights in the state of Alabama to sit in the courtroom. You had no rights for any notification. They didn't have to tell you anything. They could plead out your murderer, your rapist, someone that molested your child or murdered your child, and didn't have to contact you period until January 1st, 1996, which amended our Constitution to include the Crime Victims' Bill of Rights. And what that said, there were 8 rights in there within 72 hours that a police officer or responding officer is supposed to do for you within 72 hours once a crime happens. They're supposed to tell you about emergency and crisis services, which here locally is Safe Place. If it's a domestic violence case, it's one place of the Shoals. If it's a sexual assault or domestic violence, anyone that's in a crisis, you can come to one place. Framers Children's Center, where Chase is, that is on the crisis list, Salvation Army and River Bend. But that officer is supposed to tell you that information within 72 hours, that responding officer or whoever's responsible for the investigation. And they're also supposed to tell you about the availability of victims' compensation, which there's Alabama Crime Victims Compensation Commission here in the state of Alabama, where if you're a victim of a violent crime, you may be eligible for compensation for certain things. Medical expenses, counseling, lost wages, travel expenses, those are some of the things that they pay for. But you have to cooperate with law enforcement and the district attorney's office, and you have to pay a police report. It's the only thing that is required for you to be eligible for crime victims compensation in the state. They're supposed to give you the telephone number of the law enforcement officer that's in charge of the case. They're supposed to give you the steps in the criminal justice process, which I have brochures there are hours and that have explained the steps to you. And they have the emergency services numbers listed in that brochure. So we have those in ours. They're supposed to tell you about your rights under the Alabama Constitution as a victim, and tell you that there's a form that you can sign to invoke your rights. Part of the Victims' Rights in the state of Alabama says that every prosecutor's office, because we work for prosecutors, that's where our boss is. But we are required to statute to do lots of things. And one of those things is if you want to invoke your rights, you can sign a form that says I will invoke my rights, which means I want to be informed about everything that's going on. We do not require that here in Lauderdale County because we have a district attorney that requires us to notify everybody, whether you want to or not. We're going to try to find you if you're a victim of a crime. And that includes sometimes sending your information to an investigator if you're a victim of a sexual assault or child abuse or homicide survivor. We are going to do that. We're going to try to find you, whether you sign that form or not. But by the Constitution, you were supposed to fill out that form if you want to be notified. And they're supposed to tell you about your requirements for restitution and how to get that. And what to do if you're threatened or intimidated. That officer is supposed to tell you that, which is called 911. the name and telephone. This is the most important thing, and this is what when I go and teach classes to law enforcement officers, that 8th thing says, give them the contact number to the person in the district attorney's office that will be responsible for contacting them about crimes. So if they do that one thing, if they give them our telephone number, we can take care of those other 7 things. And I have a lot of other things about the statute, but I know I only have a few minutes. But so does anybody have any questions? And I have a copy of the Victims' Rights Statute and the Bill of Rights, and what victims have a right to in the state of Alabama that's up here. if anybody wants to talk. And we are all certified by the state. We have to go through a 40-hour course with the state of Alabama that is done by the Office of Prosecution Services.
All right. She'll be sticking around for some. Take the Zoom call real quick. Waiting to see if there's anybody in there. Those of you who don't work here, back in October, Dr. Stiles participated in our professionals in psychology panel. She's traveled again today, and we're excited to hear what she has to say. For those of you who have kind of come in since the last iterated this, the little scan, the QR code on the pamphlets, make sure you scan that, and it'll say like re-register or register again. Make sure you go through and do that. That's the check-in. Make sure you do all the bonus points for your classes if you're a professor else. All right. Thank you. And you have the slides.
Okay, so I have some slides because I'm a visual learner. So I have a series of slides that I use to help people better understand what we do in the field of forensic psychology. So we're going to put those up for you, and there were printed out copies here. So if you want to take one, you can. Okay, so how do I make it go forward? Oh, you're gonna do it. Look at that. Okay, so the first slide that I had is going to give you some information about the Office of Forensic Mental Health Services, which is the office that I oversee for the Alabama Department of Mental Health. And you will be able to see a web link on the slide, but it's easier if you just Google Alabama Department of Health, Office of Forensic Mental Health Services, and you'll be able to see various resources that tie to forensic mental health that the department is engaged in. So what does my office do? You've heard a lot today about the role of the state from the district attorney's office. You've learned a lot about what resources and services are available for victims of crime, which is very important. The Department of Mental Health's role and responsibility is twofold. One of our primary roles and responsibilities is to serve as an agent of the state, to provide expert testimony and evaluation services for defendants who are believed to or may have mental illness or a mental health condition. So looking at those offenders who committed a felony offense, who have a mental health, possible mental health or a confirmed mental health diagnosis or condition. So that's one group that we look at, evaluation services. And then in another role, some of us within the department are delivering services, mental health treatment services to people who have or are suspected of having committed a felony offense in the state of Alabama. Okay, so you've heard about the state side and the victim side, and what the department does is either serves as an agent for a state, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, or we engage in the direct provision of services. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take us all back to maybe 7th, 8th grade civics, okay? So really, to learn about what we do, you have to think about what we do in relation to the legal process. All right, so here's my little low budget, because you know it's a state, we don't have infographics and cool stuff like that. So I made this with clip art to help people understand really what we do and where we are involved in this process. Okay, so you'll see step number 1. Someone believes that a crime happened, and what we always think of is they're going to call the police, right? Hello, 911. So-and-so punched me when I was walking down the sidewalk. Okay, then we move on to number 2. So your police are gonna get involved and they're gonna do an investigation. Okay, so they're gonna look at who was the potential victim. They're going to be looking at any potential witnesses. And they're going to be going through the process of collecting their evidence, hopefully using proper procedures. Okay, so they're doing their investigation, trying to figure out what happened, and then hopefully they come to a place where they identify a suspect. So they say, okay, now I believe who committed this crime. All right, so what happens? Person comes in, they get arrested, okay, they'll go down to jail, and they get what we call booking. So they're gonna get all their paperwork, and they're gonna learn about where they are in this process and what they're accused of doing. And then they're gonna have the opportunity to go to an initial hearing. So between arrest and booking, in some cases, they may be held in jail and waiting for that hearing. In some cases, they may be permitted to go home or go somewhere else and then return. But they're gonna go to their initial hearing and they're gonna appear before the judge. And at that point, they're gonna learn whether or not they're eligible for bail. And they're also going to determine whether or not they need a lawyer, if they have a lawyer, or if they need one appointed, right? That all make sense? Okay, so most of us have seen that on TV. All right, and then after the initial hearing, they go before the grand jury. And the grand jury is gonna make a decision about whether or not there's enough evidence to move forward with the case. Okay, so that's step number 1. Okay, so that's our process part 1. We're gonna go to part 2, and I'm gonna tell you how this ties into what we do in forensics. Okay, so then we're gonna go over to arraignment. All right, this is important, keep this step in your mind. So at arraignment, you're now, hopefully you've had time to work with your attorney, and then you're going to have to consider things like, what's the amount of evidence in the case? How many witnesses were there? What are the circumstances surrounding my case? Do I have a busload of charges in my history? Or is this the first time I've had this type of offense? What is all the evidence against me? And then the person is gonna have to work with their attorney to decide what they're gonna plead. Okay? So in the state of Alabama, there's 4 types of pleas. You could plead guilty. Okay, so you could say, yep, not looking good. I assaulted that person and there's 15 million witnesses. And so, I might as well just plead guilty. And usually at that point, they'll go to the DA who we have here and they'll figure out, can we get some sort of bargain? If I plead guilty, can I get 5 years instead of 10, right? So they could plead guilty and then they go to a plea deal. They could plead not guilty and say, I didn't do the crime, and they could go to trial. Okay, so you've probably seen that play out. Then they could plead not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, which we call NGRI in the state, not guilty by reason of insanity. So we call it NGRI, but how we describe it doesn't match the acronym. It drives me nuts, but I don't write the laws, I just follow them, that's what I would say. Okay, so you could plead not guilty by reason of insanity. And the 4th plea is not as common, but I do see it. It's not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity. Okay, so basically, in the first case, NGRI, you're going to be pleading that I did the crime, but at the time of the offense, due to a serious mental disease or defect, I was not able to appreciate the wrongfulness of the act. Okay, so for example, it could be a murder case, and we do see them. I shot and killed my next door neighbor, but I was hearing voices at the time telling me that I had to kill her because if I didn't, X, Y, and Z was going to happen. That evaluation to figure out whether the person is even eligible to present that is done by the Department of Mental Health. So that is what our forensic examiners do. And so when we're asked to conduct evaluation on that matter, we are acting on behalf of the state. We're not going into it saying, I really like this person, and it's really wrong that they killed this kitten. So I'm gonna go ahead and fine them NGI so they can avoid the consequence. You have to be a neutral evaluator at that point. And so in the state of Alabama, if it's paid for by the state, it's a certified forensic examiner acting on behalf of the state. We're not partial one way or the other. So let's say you plead NGRI, now there has to be a determination made. And if you were found not guilty by reason of insanity, or not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity, it doesn't mean you get to go home and meet your order for treatment. So I know when I first started working in this profession, my mother, my very own mother, would say, oh, you just want to see these people get off. They're going to go in and say they had a mental illness and they get off from their crime. How many of you heard of that? It doesn't happen that way. So if you plead NGI and you're found not guilty by reason of insanity, you were then ordered under a court order into treatment. And oftentimes that means that that person is in one of our secure facilities, which in the state of Alabama is Taylor Hardin Secure Medical Facility or Rice Hospital. And once you're found NGI, the court has oversight of you for the rest of your existence. So I have guys at Taylor Hardin, gentlemen, who, if they had pled guilty, they would have probably served 5 to 7 years on a drug charge, that are now under the auspices of the court 15, 20 years later. And they can't leave the secure hospital until the court grants them permission to do so. And even then, they can step down to a group home. They still remain under the oversight of the court. Okay? So forensic examiners are doing an evaluation to help the court make the decision about whether a person is not guilty by reason of insanity or not. And if they are found, they're ordered to treatment. The other two, you can see guilty, not guilty, or not guilty, you move to trial. You could have a jury trial, a bench trial, and then sentence. Same thing for NGI. You could, usually those cases are heard only before a judge, but you could request a jury to review that matter. All right, so let's you go to the next slide. Okay, so we talked a lot about mental state at the time of the offense. And so our forensic examiners are evaluating the issue of whether or not the person, due to serious mental disease or defect, was able to appreciate the wrongfulness of their crime and the nature of their crime, right? So that's one type of evaluation. The other type of evaluation that we do is actually pre-trial, and that has to do with competency. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief history. Now, people study this stuff for years. I'm going to give you a snippet because I want you to have an interest and maybe go read about it. This is pretty cool stuff. Okay, so competency. So going back to where we were before, I want you to think about before that arraignment. Okay, earlier in that process, after the arrest and your initial hearing and all that. So if we look back in history about competency, competency is, do you have the ability or the understanding to move forward with your legal case? Can you talk and work with your attorney and do you understand what you're charged with? Okay. So back in the day when going back to the English courts, what they would do in order to find out if someone did a crime, let's say you did a crime and you didn't want to admit to it. Yeah, I stole the Twinkies, right? But I'm not going to admit to it. So what they would do is they would lay the person down. I got my little picture here. And they would put stones on their chest. And they would keep adding weight and keep adding weight and keep adding weight. And what they would say is that if you came around and you say, okay, I did it, take these stones off my chest, that meant you were mute by malice. Mute by malice meant you just didn't want to talk and you didn't want to admit to stealing the Twinkies, but now you do because we put these stones on your chest. So, you're guilty and move along. Okay, but if the person had all of these on their chest and they didn't respond, didn't confess, they considered you mute by visitation from God, which meant you couldn't control that. And so therefore you need mental health treatment. Sound like a good way to get confessions?
Well, if you're under torture, you're
No, right, it was torture, but it was a start, right? It was at least some awareness amongst people that someone may commit a crime, and it may not be due to the fact that they're just a jerk. There may be something else going on with them. All right, so coming over to the United States, 1835, President Jackson was coming into town in his carriage, literally wasn't a carriage, not making that up. Coming into town in his carriage, and he gets out, he's speaking to this crowd of people, and somebody in the crowd gets mad and tries to shoot him. The gun misfired. So Andrew Jackson, who, you know, I don't know if I would have been that calm, walks over to the man. Guy tries shooting again and the gun misfires. And Andrew Jackson starts beating him with his cane. And after all of that, Andrew Jackson, back then, said, you know, this gentleman has some sort of mental health condition, probably not the term they used then, but acknowledge that. And so that person was sent to treatment rather than just confinement. So as we move forward into 1899, the US federal government tied this issue of competency back to our constitutional rights. And basically said, okay, under the 14th Amendment, you can't be deprived of life and liberty without due process. So that means I can't just drag you into court and say, you're guilty, you stole the Twinkie, right? I have to have due process and give you the chance to present your case. If you have a serious mental illness, you may not be able to do that. You may not be able to go in and present your case because you may not understand what's happening around you, right? And so it's protected under the Constitution. Sixth Amendment says you have a right to be represented by counsel and you have a right to confront your accusers. If I'm delusional and I'm hearing voices and I believe that somebody's communicating, literally, I have a female who believes somebody's communicating to her through a plate. She believes her husband put it in her head. She can't confront accusers because her thoughts are not organized in a way that would allow her to be able to work with her attorney and confront her accusers. So in the 1800s, this became a protection under the Constitution. All right, and then we move forward to the most recent standard. So for those of you who are interested in forensic psychology, you're going to learn about the Dusky Standard. So Dusky really sets the standard for the states, most of the states going forward. Basically, Dusky was a gentleman who was in his 30s. He was driving with his son and a friend in a car somewhere en route. They stopped and picked up a couple girls, and somewhere en route there was a rape. And Dusky was part of this. And so there was a question about whether or not Dusky was mentally fit to proceed. So he was sent to a hospital and he was evaluated. And in that case, the psychiatrist came back and said, okay, he was oriented in all spheres, meaning he knew who he was, he knew the date, he knew the time, he knew the place. And so he's competent to proceed. So he moved forward, but he had symptoms of schizophrenia. He was sentenced. And then he filed for an appeal. And so it was reviewed. And based upon that review, the court came back and said, okay, it's not sufficient to just be oriented in time, person, place, etc. But you have to understand your charges, what is before you, what you're accused of, the legal proceedings, and you have to be able to work with your attorney. So it really came up with this two-pronged test that we use today. So all of this history helps to bring understanding of why we're looking at competency. So can you go to the next one? So mental state, we already talked about. Mental state is going back and looking at the person's condition at the time of the crime, at the time the Twinkies were stolen. Competency is looking at present, right now, as of today. And so when a competency evaluation is ordered, usually the person is in this first stage of the legal process. So have they been convicted of a crime yet? Not yet, right? They haven't even entered a plea because they can't enter a plea unless they're competent. So forensic examiners are going to be conducting their evaluation services here to look at are they competent now. And they're going to conduct evaluations of mental state at the time of the offense. Then there's other evaluations. Could they waive their Miranda rights if they provided a statement? Can they waive the right to an attorney? There's many other evaluations that would be, but competency is much earlier in that process. Okay, so let's say they went to the grand jury. The grand jury says, yes, there's enough evidence, they move forward. The court believes the person is incompetent. So at that point then, remember how I said that we have examination services and then we actually deliver services to defendants, that's when our teams will work with the defendant to help restore them to competency so that they can move forward with their case. So who does that? Well, we offer that in our hospitals, and we're going to be offering it in the community. It could be licensed professional counselors. Med management is part of restoration. Things like anger management, daily living skills. Do you know how to behave in court? Do you know how to dress properly? Grooming, hygiene, all of those things. So there's a lot that goes into that restoration where we're delivering services to the defendant to achieve stability so they can move forward with their case. Does that make sense? Okay. And then we already talked about what happens if there's a mental state evaluation done. Okay, so if the person's been NGRI, it's going to be similar to competency restoration, except for our clinical services for those who are found NGRI are to help achieve psychiatric stability, achieve behavioral stability, and then to be able to help that person so they can function as independently as possible in order to maintain safety, right? So that might be medication management and stabilization. It might be therapeutic interventions. If there's a history of trauma, we're going to offer treatment. And so really, as we talked about the services that we deliver to victims, we do offer the same menu of services to those who are NGRI. In addition to that, we have to look at level of risk because there are some defendants or patients that we cannot release due to concerns related to safety. So we're always having to mitigate how we're supporting the person to help them live independently as they can, but also how do we make sure that we protect the safety of the public. Okay, so this slide kind of bundles up what we do as forensic psychologists. Because people don't know, right? They don't know in forensic mental health what we do. And so we deliver our evaluation services. We have inpatient and outpatient services if someone is found incompetent. And then we have our services for those who are found NGRI. The vast majority of our cases are ordered to us for treatment in order for the person to return to court and proceed. Very few people are actually adjudicated NGRI, and that's just, it's not an Alabama trend, it's a national trend. I think people think it happens a lot more than it does, but very few people are actually adjudicated NGRI. The vast majority of the patients that we see are pre-trial, and we're trying to get them stable so they can return to court at some point. Any questions? You want me to hold questions? If there's questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Any questions? Yes. We have a whole team of, we do rely a lot on social workers, but they're not, they are forensic social workers. So what they do for us is they provide case management services. They provide direct services to the patients as well as discharge planning. The other thing that they do for us is they complete some of our risk assessment and risk reviews. In the state of Alabama, in order to actually become a forensic examiner, the law requires that the person be a psychologist or psychiatrist. But so our social workers help us with the day-to-day treatment and helping to move our defendants through that process through the provision of services. Now, some states do use social workers as examiners, and I think at some point we're going to have to look at that in our state, but it's going to require changing the statute. Yes.
Why do you believe like so many like cases, even cases that like some people may believe should go through as NGRI? Why do you believe that they don't end up going through?
That's a tricky question. When we're looking at mental state at the time of the offense, we're going back and looking at what that person's functioning was at that time. And the available evidence that we had as examiners as far as whether or not they were suffering from a mental illness and whether or not having that mental illness impacted their decision-making and whether or not they were able to understand the wrongfulness of their actions. One thing that we see is a lot of the cases are associated with substance abuse. And substance abuse does not make someone eligible for an NGRI in the state of Alabama. So serious mental illness does not include substance abuse, and it does not include repeated antisocial behavior. So it would have to be evidence that the person was like actively psychotic at the time of the offense. We do have quite a few people who stay pretrial, and because of the severity of their mental illness, aren't able to enter a plea or to even move forward because their mental illness is so severe. We see that much more frequently than we do the NGI adjudication.
Yes. So, is there a big differentiation between people who like already have a previous diagnosis of something like schizophrenia and that could impact their illness versus people who don't previously have a diagnosis, and then you have to go back and look and discern, well, do I think they have one now, or?
Usually, we're able to gather enough evidence to be able to differentiate. We interview family members, we'll interview other people, you know, close friends of the family. We'll go back and look at school records. So we do try to find as much information as we can. But as long as it's not a developmental disability or intellectual disability, we could still look at their present functioning. So if they weren't diagnosed at the time, but we say, okay, they clearly had schizophrenia and they likely experienced these symptoms at the time, we would present that evidence to the court. But in the state, the court has the final authority. So we could find someone not competent to proceed. We could find someone who has schizophrenia, who likely was experiencing symptoms at the time of the offense, but the court retains the final authority on that. We're simply rendering an opinion and acting on behalf of the state. Any other questions? Okay, I'll be here afterwards if there's other questions.
Okay, thank you so much. We're having a problem with like USB output.
While they're sorting that out, I could have started talking to you. Now, is everybody here? From my understanding, most of you are sociology, psychology. What's the other one?
Like, I'm criminal justice.
You're
Some
criminal
people might
justice.
be.
All right, so criminal justice. Is there anyone who's a physical science major? All right, so you have there's some. Okay. All right, I just wanted to know how it is, so I know how to teach my presentation. So I'm Dr. Ellen Wenisongbole. You can check out my background. So I'm an associate professor in forensic science at the University of Birmingham in Alabama. And so I've been lecturing for about 10 years, 10, 12 years in forensic science. So my career went a different path. All right, that's fine. Okay, so that's my slide. So, no, just behind just the intro slide. So I wanted to come more from a angle of how did I get here? What is my career path? And you have different career paths. This is mine as a physical scientist. I had a chemistry degree, etc. So how did I end up as a forensic science associate professor? But your path might be similar in terms of the journey, not necessarily the discipline. So I just wanted to come from that angle. And my own research area is in illicit drugs. So a lot of my research is in finding out about illicit drugs, whether it's fentanyl-based opioids, and in wastewater, just seized drugs. So that's kind of like my research area that I look at. But I'll talk about it a bit more about that later on. And if you look at the pictures, those are the different natural sources of drugs of abuse. So obviously the cannabis plant, purposeful. Does anyone know where that produces?
Opioids?
Yes, opioids. Heroin, morphine, that's the big one. What about the other one? Am I in the way?
Cocaine.
Beg your pardon?
Cocaine.
Cocaine, yeah. It's in the name. Coca. All right. Familiar with that, right? You know the watch now? Bonds, yeah. And then you have CSI, there's so many other forensic files, medical detective, those based on true life cases. And all this is fictional. We had other speakers who talked about the CSI effect and how important it is in cases with the jury records, etc. But it does, a lot of people or students join forensic science courses because of this TV program. So there was a rush into forensic science because everybody believes this is how it works. But it's not. As a a lot of people, cases are not solved in a day or 2 weeks, sometimes it's 3 months, it could be a year. Just depends on the evidence and how long they investigate. And I'm not going to go into everything forensic science, but forensic science basically places physical evidence into a professional discipline. So it's applying the different disciplines, whether it's chemistry, biology, physics, geology, psychology, into a civil and criminal law. So it places that into a professional discipline. And we've had the previous presentation on forensic psychology and how that impacts or how it relates to the criminal justice system. Everything we do in forensic science is related to the criminal justice system. Right? So it's a relationship between the law and science. Even forensic scientists in a crime lab, they have to work within the confines of the law. So if a crime is committed, I mean, I cannot just come up to you and say, hey, you committed a crime. That's why you're going to jail. No, that's an accusation. I mean, the criminal process has to take effect. But at the same time, there has to be evidence. I mean, that evidence has to be gathered, whether it's data, could be digital forensics, could be physical evidence, or any other evidence has to be gathered, and a strong case has to be made against you. And then science evidence is found, but it's not strong enough to make a case. That crime will not go to trial in a sense. That's when you say that, oh, that person was guilty, but they didn't go to jail. That's because there wasn't enough evidence. The prosecutor thought they don't have enough evidence to win a case. So that happens quite a bit as well. But sometimes they need more time to gather the evidence. For the disciplines, I focus more on the physical chemistry, on the physical science disciplines in a sense, except for forensic anthropology. So it's more from the physical sciences aspect. But these are all the forensic disciplines. There's some of them, not all of them. There's so many others. But a lot of this we teach at University of Alabama, the Masters in Forensic Science program. We have the minor in forensic science, but the key focus is the Masters in Forensic Science. And we touch on a lot of things, except wildlife forensics. That's something I did in South Africa as well. And I'll touch a bit about that. And most people ask, what can I do with a forensic science degree? Well, there's so much that you can do actually. And that It's not just working in a crime lab, it's not just working in the police department or law enforcement department. There's Customs and Border Patrol. We have some graduates who are working in Customs and Border Patrol. You have accident investigation. We have so many chemical industry. My first job, once I had my master's in forensic science, was to work in a pharmaceutical company. They were making cancer drugs. And they actually hired me because of my forensic science degree, in terms of the transferable skills. I don't know if you hear that at all, but if you hear about transferable skills, that's actually more important than a lot of things. If you have a science background, you can work in a lot of these science places because they're looking at your transferable skills. Do you have meticulous attention to detail? Can you write technical reports? Can you do an experiment from start to finish? Sometimes you do mini research projects. Have you worked on the research project? So once you have that, they can look at your degree, but it doesn't have to fit that particular discipline. Let me clarify that. If you're working from drug analysis in a forensic lab, they'll likely have a forensic chemistry degree, but you don't have to. They can take somebody with a biology degree and train them to analyze drugs. They prefer those with a chemistry degree because you already have some background. You've been trained a little bit, so the training won't be as long. So you just have them look at transferable skills, and that's why I was hired in a pharmaceutical lab, and also a doping control laboratory. I don't know if you know what a doping control laboratory is. Anyone familiar with that? Yes? What is that? What is a doping control? You're just familiar with it?
Yeah.
Doping control, for those who are not familiar, is labs which analyze athletes' urine and blood after sporting events for performance enhancing substances. I mean, that is big. It's a big thing going on, with a lot of alleged, I have to say alleged, cheating in whether it's Olympics, World Games, or Commonwealth Games, whatever games are. So whoever comes out first, second, and third, they get the gold medal, the silver medal, the bronze. They can get the trophy, but they'll not get the prize money until the urine test comes out negative. And that can be some days or weeks. So that's the doping control laboratory. Whenever there are big games, that's what happens. But the athletes are not just, their urine is not just tested during big sporting events. They are tracked during the year. So professional athletes cannot rest. Even if they go on a holiday, it's off season and they're on holiday, they can be tracked and say, hey, they need to take a urine sample. But they're not supposed to have performance enhancing substances at any time throughout the year. So that's a doping control laboratory. So I just want to show that there's so many careers that somebody can have with the forensic science degree. These are just some of the jobs our forensic master and forensic science graduates have gone on to. Just different Customs and Border Control, forensic labs, and PhD programs. So with a master's, you can choose, like I did, to proceed to PhD and become a professor, which actually wasn't a career path, but we'll talk about that. Yeah, so this is how I started out. I did not want to be a professor. My parents were. I saw how much work they did, the grading, and it was just too demanding for them getting. So that was the last thing on my mind. But here it is, professor. After I have a chemistry degree from applied chemistry in South Africa. That was my undergraduate degree. After I finished that, I did not want to see textbooks or a professor in my life again. So you can see how my life went. Some of it's like, once I finished my undergraduate, I'm done with school. That was me. But here I am with a PhD. So after working for 7 years, I realized to get ahead in that company, I wanted to be a scientist behind the scenes. But to get ahead, everybody had a master's or PhD degree. Those were scientists, product development. That's what I wanted to be for Procter & Gamble, so cosmetics. So I'm like, okay, let me just leave, get my master's degree, and then come back to work for Procter & Gamble. Well, that didn't materialize. I did my forensic science master's degree, chemistry, and then started working. And once you started working, it's quite difficult. I mean, I worked, stopped, then gone back to school, then started working again as a quality control analyst. That's a healthcare pharmaceutical company. So after getting my master's, I was hired as an analyst in a pharmaceutical company. And then I went for a little bit, and then they studied by it again. And this is me, who after undergraduate said I do not want to see professors again or a textbook. So somehow I ended up doing a PhD in forensic science and chemistry in the UK. And I became a part-time lecturer, then an analyst in the doping control laboratory. And then after a while, I'm like, let me go back to South Africa and Botswana, my region, and contribute to there. Let me give something back to my home continent. So I started developing forensic science courses in South Africa and Botswana. In South Africa, they had a big DNA program, but they didn't have the criminalistic side. So I went to develop that. In Botswana, it was the first forensic science program. Botswana and South Africa, they're at the bottom of Africa. It's not the map of Africa. That's the very bottom. So I did that for a while. And then the travel by did again. And that's how I ended up here. So I talked about my research background in illicit drugs and drug analysis. Well, if you look at what is forensic drug analysis, it's identifying substances that are present that are of forensic interest and quantify the amount if possible. The key two ways of forensic interest. But you can analyze, you can bring a powder to me to analyze. And if I found out it's powdered sugar or baking soda, I couldn't care less, I'll just give it back to you. So it has to be forensic interest. If I find cocaine, if I find MDMA, ecstasy, that's of forensic interest. So something that can lead to a charge. So sucrose, all those are cutting agents, bulking agents that are added in drugs, just to make them go a long way. So somebody will get a dealer will have a small packet, maybe a pound, but they'll bulk it up into maybe 3 pounds before they sell it off, so they make more money out of it. So they add a lot of stuff in it. Those are what we call bulking agents and cutting agents. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. And sometimes they also mix drugs. You can find somebody's innocently taking cocaine, which they know they've been taking for a while, but then somebody decides to lace it with fentanyl. And then they end up with a drug overdose or sick in hospital. So that's what we try to find out. The truth is, the reality is, there'll always be users of drugs. Many of you might have family members, friends, or people you know who are using drugs in various aspects. So they'll all be users, but you don't necessarily want them dead. You don't necessarily want whoever you know to die from using drugs. But that's what's happening. When you hear a lot of drug overdoses, people have been using maybe some drugs for a while, and then the supplier changes the formulation. So somebody thinks, well, I've been using this for 1 year with this guy. And meanwhile, that guy had to fentanyl or some opioid or xylazine. But you didn't say anything. That's the latest, the zombie drug. I'll try. But I'll get to it next. Okay, so these are just some of the headlines you hear about. DLF is 6 out of 10 fentanyl related prescription pills. So innocent is taking prescription pills and they're related to fentanyl. And in fact, there are lots of pills like Adderall and Ritalin, which circulate around campuses. So somebody has a prescription and they share with friends, or some people are getting illegal prescriptions and they're sharing among the student population. But you have to be careful of the source, because those could be fake pills. They could be laced with fentanyl, but they might be sold as Ritalin or Adderall, but they're not that. They're mixed. It's a bit of Adderall, but it's been mixed with fentanyl and they become deadly. So you just have to, people have to be aware of the source of the drugs that we get. So we know that we can't get rid of drugs, it's there, but we just analyze it for control purposes, because the drugs are brought to us. Law enforcement will seize drugs from somebody, a suspect, bring to the lab for analysis. And all we tell them is like, yes, it has cocaine, or yes, it's ecstasy, yes, it's fentanyl and some opioid, or this and that. That's what we do. We just have to analyze it. And if we call to give evidence as an expert witness, then we go to court and give an evidence. But most of the time, just based on the technical report, the case will go to trial. We don't have to give evidence as an expert witness. And I say I don't work in a forensic crime lab. As I said, I'm a professor, and we train forensic science students for the forensic labs of whatever career they will end up in. And however, the forensic labs give in-house training. So there's specific in-house training for whatever division a student or somebody who's hired by them ends up in. So if you're going to be firearms and ballistics, they'll train you in firearms and ballistics. And that in biochemistry, you get further training. So in terms of any forensic science courses, is to give a background, a basis, where you're easily trainable once you reach the forensic lab or wherever you end up. So xylazine, this is a new zombie drug. This is the animal sensitive and friendly liver. It's a latest thing, identified in multiple recent illicit drug seizures, illicit opioids, including fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, and other drugs. And unfortunately now, for the vets who need the veterinarians who now need them, there's restriction on this. So the government has come in with controls because now it's illegally being obtained so that it can be used with other illicit drugs. So there are now strict controls on that. So just like Adderall, there were controls on Adderall. People really needed Adderall, started struggling to get it because it was restricted. And it causes ulcers and rotten flesh and PD because they're sedative. So people just come like a zombie. So it's like a very potential problem. Analyzing it, and more and more cases are being seen across the nation. Yeah, and fentanyl. Fentanyl used to be a different color, but suddenly had all these rainbow colored fentanyl pills, and that's because the premise is to attract kids and young adults with this colorful thing. There's a concept in marketing called point of market entry. Like if you want to advertise something or sell something, target the entry level. Where is somebody going to start buying that product? So for you, before they leave high school, before they leave elementary school, start selling laptops, for instance. I'm just talking about the legal stuff. So suppliers and drug dealers have the same concept. Like, okay, we need to get down, we need to get lower and lower so we have customers for life. So let's start targeting elementary school. And you have that across the world. You have suppliers targeting elementary school kids, selling drugs, disguising them in candy type things. And there's a story in South Africa where this mother used to wonder why her child was so addicted to this candy that she used to get from the school. There was a lady selling outside the school gates, that's allowed. And this kid was addicted to this candy, but later on the father was laced with the drug. So they're trying to get them back there because they're a customer for that. And so that's a concern. And these are just pictures of clandestine lab. This is the most sophisticated one, the lower one. This is where drugs are, illicit drugs are made. Most of the time, that's a bit rudimentary. It's like in a kitchen or a laundry. Yeah, it's like in a kitchen. We go to the next one. This is very, looks like this is quite very rudimentary. You can see very basic light. It's an unfinished wedding place. And they have all this rudimentary chemistry going on. And so when a crime lab is raided, this is what you normally find. You find signs which point to what method is being used to make that drug. And from that, you can deduce what drug it is. Although you test it, you also find a finished product. This could be the intermediate or it could be the final product. So that's also a sample is taken for testing. So I'm just cutting like, as the other speaker said, we have hours and hours of this, but we have to condense like 10 to 15 minutes. Next. Yeah, so there's a little. You see the little, for those who can see, it's a funnel and a separatory funnel for separation, because I have to separate and take maybe the top layer, the bottom layer, and then purify that further. So it's a basic chemistry going on. But these are things people read online. It's not like everybody can. Yeah, so that was on the drugs. I really quickly went into it, but our aim, my research is finding out there's this drug called Yaoke in South Africa. It's a mixture of heroin, cannabis, and sometimes rat poison, some caffeine. So it's always mixed differently. So we're trying to find out what's in it and can we recognize it from, can we link it to one supplier or one, and which is very difficult because unlike making ecstasy or cocaine, cocaine or amphetamine. This is a mixture of already made drugs. The student gave me a good analogy, said like a salad. So it's like a salad. So salad has a lot of tomatoes, sometimes it's a lot of lettuce, sometimes it's more carrots. So you never know how that salad is made. So we call it a cocktail drug because it's mixed in so many different ways and each one can be different. It's quite challenging in terms of the drug aspect. That's part of my research. Finding out what is in this drug so that we can now warn people that, hey, be careful, this area is seeing a lot of cocaine laced with fentanyl. So be careful of collecting the cocaine. A lot of things. So you can't say just stop using it. People use it to find out what it is and warn people. Other aspect is finding out what drugs are in wastewater. So we can look at the wastewater treatment plants in this area in Florence and find out what people are using. So it doesn't link to a person, but it links to a community. And yes, there's some drugs you can't really distinguish from medical use versus illicit, and there are many others which you can distinguish. So that's one thing with wastewater that I've been looking at for a long time. And this is another research project I was working on with a student of mine master's. I'm looking at drugs implicated in DFSA, drug facilitated sexual assault or day trade. And how stable are they? A lot of day trade incidents, a person, by the time the report or remember, it's maybe 3 or 4 days later, and that has metabolized and it's out of their system. And sometimes a lot of victims will share to go and report the case. So it goes unreported in many cases, just like typical sexual assault cases, So now we're thinking, what about the alternative samples? If the drink was still there, because a lot of day trade is it's usually at parties or small houses, so sometimes it's at your own house or your own place. So if the drink was kept, how stable would the drug that was spiked, how long would it last? And can it be detected? So we're looking at the stability of those spiked drinks and see how long they will last. And the other research we're looking at was, okay, fine. It's spiked. It's one thing if there's drinks still in a cup, but what if there isn't? Somebody drinks and then they realize they were dry. I mean, that's too late. That's like 3 or 4 days later. But the cup is still there of the glass and there's residue. So it's dried up, but it hasn't been washed. Can you detect the drug that was spiked in there when it's dry? There's just residue. Yes, you can. That's the research we do that you can still detect. It has to be a very sensitive method, but you can detect that. And the only thing is you don't know how much people put. So we're using tetrahydrozole, which is in eye drops. And because sometimes people use eye drops to spike drinks, but we just don't know how many drops are used by specific drinks. So that's some of the research we do. And lastly, any idea how this fits in forensic science? Any guesses? What is still these are African animals, but those are trace evidence. You've heard of trace evidence, right? Here, sample. You mentioned earlier only all living trace evidence here, and also taking sample. So that was already mentioned. So trace evidence is the key evidence. So that's one aspect, but I don't go into that. It's about poaching. A lot of these animals are being poached and finishing, especially the rise of the elephant. Very great about that. So you have CITES, which is trying to protect animals. The CITES list, you cannot transport animal parts, etc. So one way of distinguishing between species is the next slide, please. The hair. So can you believe that all those species, are you able to distinguish those species just from the hair, looking at the hair? Because sometimes what happens is a poacher will kill the animal, which is a smaller one, skin it, and then have the meat. So it's very hard to distinguish just the meat. If somebody has red meat, you can't really tell, say, hey, that's a bush baby, or you took something that's illegal, and then someone really knows. You need DNA analysis, etc. But sometimes they'll have hair, the meat will have hair. So you can analyze that hair to confirm what the animal is. But I'll show you some pictures. So like these are scale patterns from different animals. You can see the light spotted herring and water boat, impala, they have different scale patterns. But I can't can't go into detail, but not all animals have different scale patterns. So you can have a number which have the regular weight scale pattern. So how do you distinguish that? Here it's easy, but what if you have 10 different species which have this scale pattern? Right? So now you look at the cross section, the cortex, because here has 3 layers, the cuticle, cortex, and medulla. So now you go to the next layer. And they can be same, they can have the same scale pattern, but there's cross section to be different. Next, please. And sometimes the cross sections are similar, so then you look at the medulla and don't have different medulla pattern. So we're able to narrow it down to an animal species, not necessarily distinguishing one. You can narrow down to a certain extent, and with other evidence, a case can be made. So that's yeah, oh, okay, that's us, that's a forensic science program, just like plug it in. I think there's some handouts we're given in the interim, but that's an access program, and that's 3 of us, and if you need any information, go to that. And I was actually supposed to be here, but I was standing for my program director. And if you have any questions, what's me? I know I went very quickly, but. Okay, but I'll be around, anyone has any questions or clarify anything. Thank you very much.
My name is Daniel Atherton. I'm a forensic pathologist from Birmingham, Alabama. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you for just a few minutes today. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. Perhaps another time. So as I mentioned, I'm a forensic pathologist. So what exactly does a forensic pathologist do? Well, in very simple terms, my job is to determine cause and manner of death of people that die suddenly or unexpectedly in Jefferson County. So to become a forensic pathologist, I had to go to medical school and receive my medical degree. I did that in Louisiana from 2004 to 2008. And then I decided to subspecialize in a kind of medicine called pathology. So I did a pathology residency, and that's about 4 years. Pathology is basically the study of disease. So most of the time, pathologists end up kind of working in a hospital or clinic and reading biopsies or lab values from blood work, things like that, and communicating those findings with a clinician. One subspecialty of pathology is called forensic pathology, and that's what I do. Forensic pathology is eventually specifically concerned with determining cause and manner of death in people that generally die suddenly and unexpectedly. And so as I mentioned, I have an MD with subspecialty training in pathology and forensic pathology. I'm board certified in all these different things. So board certified in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, there's a little bit of a distinction there, and then also forensic pathology. I guess all in all, the number of years of training to become a forensic pathologist after you have a bachelor's degree would be approximately 8 to 10 years, something like that. So it is quite a long haul, but it's worth it. So what do I do as a forensic pathologist? Well, if someone dies suddenly unexpectedly within the confines of Jefferson County where we have jurisdiction, that person will be transported to the coroner's office. The coroner's office in Jefferson County is at Cooper Green Hospital. And we have a morgue there where we perform examinations. So the first thing that I really do when I have a case come in is I read about the circumstances about why they're there. So a lot of times that can give me clues or important information about how I need to proceed with my examination. So I have a picture up here on the slide where you can see some powder on a spoon and a syringe, some pills, maybe some baggies containing some sort of possible drug paraphernalia. We get a lot of overdoses now. So oftentimes, for example, when someone's found dead in their residence, there's drug paraphernalia around, well, I kind of know it's probably going to be a drug overdose. So that's not always the case, but it's important to have that sort of circumstantial information so that I can make the best determination about how to proceed with the case. Well, we don't just get drug overdoses. Obviously, we get a lot of those now. But we get all kinds of cases. We get a fair number of natural deaths, we get accidental deaths, suicide, and of course, we get a fair number of homicides now as well. But all those cases have different kinds of ways to work them up, ways to document our findings, and report those cases all out differently as well. So in terms of the steps to an actual examination, when an individual comes to the morgue, as I mentioned, I kind of read about the circumstances about why they're there. And then I go through a series of steps to perform those examinations on those individuals. So one component of the postmortem examination is an external examination. So I'll look at the outside of the body for evidence of natural disease or injuries, and I'll document those things. Part of that involves looking through people's clothes, looking through their pockets, finding whatever might be in there. It's not uncommon for us to find drug paraphernalia in people's pockets, or even bullets, for example, bullets that went through someone and didn't quite fully exit the clothing. Sometimes those will be in their clothes as well. So it's important for us to have the clothes and then document all those things for any kind of evidence that might be there. After we document all those things, it's time for the internal examination. So that's generally what we think of when we think about an autopsy, is the internal examination. So in that situation, I make the kind of wide incision that everyone's kind of seen before, and then look on the inside of the body, the organs, for evidence of disease or injuries, and I also document those things. Another important part of internal examination, for example, in someone that has been shot, would be to recover evidence, or stabbed, for example, to document what exactly injuries were there, what's the trajectory of the bullet wounds, of the gunshot wounds, what's the trajectory maybe of the sharp instrument that was used to injure that person. All those things, as you can imagine, would be important to document, because there'll be things that are important to sort of talk about and communicate later in a legal sense. It's just not a matter of doing an internal or external examination. We have various ancillary studies that are important parts of the examination. So, for example, we do radiographs. Radiographs might be important because I want to see where bullets are, how they recover them during the autopsy. And it can also show natural disease as well. A big part of what we do, as everyone knows, is toxicology. So I don't do the toxicology myself. That's sort of a separate profession, toxicology. But I gather the specimens and then send them off to the toxicology lab, and then they have their own specialty in terms of using instruments to determine what drugs are in the blood, and then also how to quantify those drugs. And then they return those results to me. And so I have a lot of information to try to finish the case with all those results. So I have the circumstances or the context of why the case is there. I have the various ancillary studies that I perform. So for example, I have the toxicology results to consider. And then the circumstances why they're, I think I already said that, my autopsy results. And then so I'll use all that information to generate my own opinion on the cause and manner of death of why someone died. I'll write a report about that, and then that document at that point in time can be used for a lot of different purposes. For example, a family might just be interested in knowing how their loved one passed away. In case of homicide, of course, those documents will go to legal authorities, attorneys, district attorney, things like that, and they'll use my findings to determine do they want to bring charges against someone, for example, maybe in a homicide kind of case. And so part of what I do, I hadn't mentioned it yet, probably, is to testify in court. So if there is a homicide, for example, not always a homicide, but usually a homicide, where someone brought charges on someone and then that person's been brought to court. If there's a court proceeding, they'll call me as an expert witness to talk about just what I'm talking about now, about how I go through my examination and document those things and what my cause and manner of that opinion is. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward. So if someone's shot from a distance, one time in the back, I can communicate those things, don't get challenged on a lot of that stuff. Occasionally we'll have more complicated cases. For example, maybe someone that dies a delayed death in the hospital, but they had an injury some months prior, it gets a little bit complicated trying to sort of tease or cipher some of those things out. Child abuse cases can be difficult as well. Did a child fall, or was this inflicted trauma? So you can imagine just how difficult some of these cases may be. And so that's a very very quick sort of general run through of sort of what I do. You see a picture down there at the bottom of the morgue. You can't see the where the body lays by there. You can see where we cut the organ, the place where we weigh the organs, all those different kinds of things. One last thing I'll show you, just so I can show you some more pictures. I'll show you some postmortem changes. So part of what we do is what I've experienced doing is knowing what is an injury and what is just postmortem change. So I'll kind of go through just a few of those things now. So on the upper left picture here, I guess you might notice my cursor here, we have livor mortis. And so you've probably heard of livor mortis before. And when someone dies, the blood stops flowing through their body, and so it's going to be kind of gravity dependent. So if someone's laying on their back, after some number of hours, you can see a purple acceleration from the blood, pulling gravity dependent towards the back. After some amount of time, that becomes fixed. So if I take my finger and I push on it, and it blanches or becomes sort of a pale area, then that's non-fixed. That's only been maybe a few hours. After some number of hours, it's kind of dependent on a lot of variables, maybe 8 or 9 hours. It becomes fixed, and so that might give you some idea of when the person might have died. So that might be important for people to know. Up on the upper right here, you can see some what we call rigor mortis. That's going to be our body requires energy so that it doesn't tense up. Basically, so that when someone dies, the energy stops being generated. And we read all about rigor mortis, the chemical changes that cause it to occur. Rigor mortis happens for some number of hours. It can develop within an hour or two, and last up to maybe 18, 24 hours, something like that. So if someone's they don't have any rigor mortis because it's all past. That might be giving you an indication that they have been dead for maybe close to a day or more. So you can see how some of these things may be helpful from a sort of forensic standpoint. This bottom left picture here just shows an eye with a drying artifact. So the untrained eye might say that that's an injury of some kind, but this is just a postmortem change from drying. And this last lower right picture right here, I'll show you is what we call mummification. So the body undergoes the decompositional changes over time. And one of the postmortem changes you can see mummification through this excessive drying of the extremities. This is just sort of some random forensic stuff. We can go a lot of different directions with this. But these are some common sort of postmortem changes that I see. And it's one element of doing an examination and knowing how to sort of interpret some of the findings. So I hope that was somewhat interesting and helpful for you. I didn't my email on the PowerPoint presentation, but I'll be sure to give that to you. I'm happy to talk to anyone that might be interested in learning more about forensics, sort of the fun things to do, and the things that require get a little bit of getting used to, I should say. So, but I appreciate the invitation to talk, and we'll go ahead and stop recording this now. I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
You guys would like more information from him, like I said, just let me know. And obviously, his email address is on the speakers list, but if you'd like more information about his office hours and talking with him and that just let me know. And I can situate for you. Our last presenter is Special Agent Johnson. If you want to come on up, we'll get you started.
Making her way to the stage. Good afternoon. I am Randy Brown. I am special agent forensic scientist with TBI and with the chemistry unit. I am not going to present because you actually heard of the things about illicit drugs, and that's what I do, so you heard it in the presentation. So Special Agent Johnson is actually going to give you an overview of all the disciplines that we have at TBI and forensic services, and she is going to put emphasis on firearms and tool mark identification. So she said, I work for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation in the firearms and tool mark identification unit. So what exactly is the TBI? Obviously, it stands for Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, but we are essentially the state level of what an FBI would be. So we serve the entire state of Tennessee, and that's 95 counties in the state of Tennessee. So we're an independent agency. Like I said, it's analogous to FBI on the federal level, and we were founded in 1951 as normally TBCI. However, a crime occurred in 1980, and that's when they established that TBI should be a thing. They wanted an unbiased agency to come in and investigate other crimes that would happen across the state of Tennessee. And there are 3 regional locations: Knoxville, Jackson, and Nashville. So this is just a picture of what Nashville headquarters looks like, which is where me and Brandy work. Jackson Crime Lab, so this crime lab actually was initially in Memphis, and they just recently opened up the Jackson one, maybe about a year or so ago, not less than that. And that is just a picture of the Knoxville Crime Lab. So at the TBI, there are essentially 2 sides of the house. You have your forensic services, and then you have what's called your investigation side. There's criminal investigations, so that includes all your agents that investigate your criminal things, so mostly homicides. You have your drug investigations, which is known as DID. They do all the drug undercover dope buys. We also have Medicaid fraud as its own division now, so it's such a big thing that now they have their own division for Medicaid. We also have technology and innovation. So anytime we get Amber Alerts in the state of Tennessee or any digital forensics, they are in that division. We also have what's called CJIS, which is Criminal Justice Information Services. They do all your background checks and your expungements. Forensic services, which I'll go into, which is where I work. Administrative services, people that do all the admin stuff. And then, of course, your training, which is where we get trained in firearms and any other close quarter combat training that we get for the Bureau. So what is forensic science? Earlier, you might have heard someone say that it's just the relationship between law and science, or application of science to a criminal matter. And there are right now, this number is not accurate because we just got a lot of positions, but at the time of the presentation, we've had approximately 90 forensic scientists and 20 forensic technicians across the state of Tennessee. So for a special agent forensic scientist, which is what I am, we are commissioned, meaning that we serve the same, we have the same powers as police officers at the Bureau, but you have to have a degree in a natural science and at least 24 semester hours of chemistry to be a special agent forensic scientist at the TBI. If you want to get into more of the forensic biology realm, you have to have a few additional classes such as statistics, cellular molecular biology, genetics, as well as biochemistry. In addition to getting this degree, you also have to go through a background check, a polygraph, as well as a physical in order to have this job. And then once you do that, you also have to do on-the-job training. I will go through what those actual training periods are for different disciplines, but it can be up to 2 years of additional training once you get the job. So here's a chart of basic time required to train to proficiency. So forensic chemistry is about 6 months. Toxicology is age 12. Blood alcohol analysis, 6 to 8. Serology, 1 to 1.5 years. Farm to tool mark, that is 2 years. Latent prints, 2 years. Microanalysis, it says 2 years. However, that training can be longer than that, because there's so many different disciplines and you can essentially what's called cross-train. So I can be certified in one thing in micro, be working those cases, but also train for another sub-discipline within micro. So that training period can go for many years. And then there's also CODIS and evidence receiving, which CODIS works very close with DNA, and then obviously evidence receiving receives our evidence. So I just want to give you a quick rundown of all the disciplines and exactly what they do, and I'll go a little bit more into depth in the firearms and tool application. So forensic biology, they are responsible for identifying and characterizing bodily fluids. So that could be blood, semen, or saliva. That could be human or animal. It can be liquid and dry or dry. And it's present in a form to suggest, a relation to the offense or persons in that crime. They also perform DNA profiling, so they are able to identify individuals involved in crime. And as I mentioned earlier, CODIS, which you heard earlier, kind of what they do as far as DNA profiles, but they primarily deal with confirming matches from a database. Next, we have forensic chemistry for drug chemistry, and Brandy works in that unit. And they are responsible for identification and of siege drugs to determine a weight and chemical composition, because this is very important for the severity of the violation based on the weight. Next, we have the toxicology unit, and they are responsible for detection identification of the drugs in normally a urine or a blood, so that could be alcohol, THC, methamphetamines, benzos, cocaine, fentanyl, or opiates. Microanalysis, or what's called trace evidence. So this unit is what's called a catch-all unit, because they do everything that other units don't do. So they do fire debris, gunshot residue, impression, explosive, pain analysis, glass fracture, fire, tape, and comparison, indentation impressions. So for example, I know they've had a case where the lady was wrapped in some type of fiber carpet, and they found a piece of fiber in her shoe. They got a sample from the house that she was suspected to be at, and they were able to match the fiber that was in her shoe, that particular house. So that's just an example of what micro would do. They also do analysis composition, so if they get, someone thinks they were poisoned, some type of substance is in a bleach in their Gatorade, they can also test that substance to see if it was actually some type of poisonous. Latent print. It is very similar to crime identification in the sense that it is a comparative science. So most prints in nature are latent or invisible unless they're enhanced in some way. So this unit has to normally enhance a fingerprint, whether that's using powders, whether that's using some type of what's called anhydrine, which is normally used on fingerprints that are on paper. So latents are actually created from the sweat and the oils in the skin, and it's transferred to a surface. I mean, of course, in order to see those, they have to be enhanced in some way. The firearm tool market application, this is what I do. That was actually a picture of me shooting a black powdered firearm. So firearm tool market application, it is a discipline of forensic science that involves looking at ammunition components and trying to identify that back to a particular firearm. So here's a list of just some of the things that my unit does. And I'll go through kind of each one. But NIBIN, which is the database that I will enter cartridge cases onto the system and see if I can get what's called a hit, or possible association between the cartridge case that I enter and a cartridge case from another crime scene. We also do firearm identification or analysis, which is the bulk of what we do, and that's actually trying to match that bullet or cartridge case back to the firearm. We also do serial number restorations. So if we get a firearm back and the serial number is obliterated, we would use different chemical processes in order to get that back. Distance determination. So in that instance, if someone wants to know how far a person, it's actually called multiple garment. So how far was this person from the gun when it was discharged? We can also determine that. Trajectory. That one is not as common anymore. We do a lot of that with officer involved with cars. We'll do trajectory at that point. but that's normally very basic of trying to say if the bullet went from left, right, or up and down, passenger, driver, side, things like that. Tool mark identification. So tool mark and firearms kind of fall into the same umbrella because you have to, as a tool mark, we're talking about a harder metal leaving marks on a softer metal. So we're talking about in terms of firearms, you have a very hard surface such as the steel barrel or the steel slide. And you have, for instance, a cartridge case or a bullet, which is a lot softer metal. You're looking at copper, you're looking at lead, sometimes you're looking at nickel. That's a lot softer. So those marks from that gun is imparted onto that softer metal. Very similarly with tool mark identification. If some type of tool such as, let's say, crowbar is used in a burglary, that is a very hard metal. Going against something softer, like wood or anything, other types of metal that's softer, it still will be manufacturing marks on that surface. So that's why they're kind of branched together as tool mark identification. We also testify in court, and a misconstrued thought is that it's called ballistics. We do not do ballistics. Ballistics is for projectiles in motion. We do, I guess you could say, terminal ballistics because we are the end stop of where that bullet has ended. So here's just a quick setup of what my unit looks like. We have a comparison microscope, which is just two microscopes that are joined together by one optical bridge that allows me to see two pieces of evidence at once. There's also a stereoscope, which is just a huge magnifying glass, and I also have dual computer monitors. Here's a picture of our firearm reference vault. So as I said, it's a 2-year training period. And during that 2-year training period in the firearms unit, we have to go through a section to disassemble, I would say, about 200 or so guns. And that is just to gain knowledge on how firearms work. Even though there's hundreds of pistols, they normally work the same. Same thing with revolvers, shotguns, rifles. And it's also important for if we get a firearm in and it's not operating. That happens a lot. So we will go in our reference collection, see if we have something similar, interchange parts, and all we need to do is fire. We need to fire in order to get the bullet and fire in order to get the cartridge case. So we can go in here and find parts, change them out, and get the gun working again. That's what we want to do. So crime scenes. I mentioned earlier that we are commissioned, so we also do crime scenes in addition to working for the lab. We are on a rotating on-call schedule. So right now, there are, I think, 5 teams, so we are every 5th month, but we are on call for the entire month, 24/7. So the purpose of that is to respond to crime scenes, locate and document evidence, and preserve integrity of evidence. So who all actually goes to the crime scene? One person at least from every unit. However, the people that are in drugs and tox, they are normally our documenters, because you're not going to collect a urine sample normally on a crime scene. So they do all the documentation, your photography, videography normally. And how does the flow of the crime scene work? So if there's a crime scene, say for instance a house, obviously, as I said, we have other agents of our criminal investigations. They are the first ones normally called to the scene. They are trained in crime scenes. However, sometimes crime scenes can just be very large and they might need to call us out. So if we get called out, they will turn the scene over to us, and normally what's called the team leader, the person that's leading that team, will go in with normally a DNA person and a micro person, because this evidence is very fragile. So they're gonna kind of go in and map out how to walk through this if it's a house. Now they want to mark things that's already there. If there's fiber, if there's a shoe impression, if there's blood, they're gonna mark that so when the other part of the team comes in, they know where that is to not sit on it or ruin the evidence. But while they're going through the house, you have your documenters, you have your videographers, your photographers, they're already on the outside, taking all the pictures, documenting the outside of this house. Once your DNA people, your micro people have said, okay, we've marked everything that we see initially, at that point, everybody else is going. Firearms is normally last because we're collecting things that are already happened, essentially. So we're doing cartridge cases on the ground, or if there's bullet holes in the walls, we're documenting that and doing testing on that. So at this point, we're responsible for any firearms on the scene. So if we do go in first, it's because the first two people that walked in saw a firearm, they don't know if it's rendered safe. So we will go in, make sure it's safe, make sure there's no ammo around, make sure there's none of the gun. At that point, we're done with that. Any bullets or bullet holes or defects in the walls, as I said, we will go through chemical processing until there's any lead residues from a particular bullet. We will do that on that. And cartridge cases, obviously we need those. Any other ammunition. This is important mostly for distance cases, because ammunition is made differently. There's different types of powder, there's different types of metals that are used, different type of composition. So that's important for distance. If we're trying to say, at this distance, this is where this firearm was shot. Well, sometimes the different type of powder, the different amount of powder can change, and that can alter our range of distance that we report. Also in tools, like I say, with burglary, we want to make sure that we actually have the tool that was used in that crime. We also have vehicles. Vehicles, we actually try to get towed back to the lab because it essentially is a mini crime scene. So we have to document an entire car like we would a house from outside in. We try to get those towed back, we work those. We also do metal detecting. Excuse me, that is important for trying to find cartridge cases or bullets that we might not be able to locate with our eyes. So with that, I will take any questions. Me and Brandy have a table set up. There's also opportunities for internships. We're recently hiring. There's also academies that we have, job shadowing, all that good stuff. So we'll be glad to answer any questions that you guys might have.
I think that concludes our speakers for today. We're so happy to have you now. Once again, just to reiterate, if you guys are here for only earning bonus points for a class, do make sure that you register and check in using the QR code on the very front. Also be able to refer to those to know what we're going to do a cycle, what we can do for you. Complete that questionnaire if you're able to on the back where it says join us. And let us know what your interests are. If you're able to come to an interest meeting, if you want to be a part of leadership or an officer of the organization, what all we can do for you. That's it. So thank you all.
She did that in the class and the whole time I opened up, she really, she wasn't able to. Yeah, that's sort of the science.
Now,
I was scared tonight.
I guess I'll just end it.